The rain poured heavily outside the hospital as 7-year-old Emma sat beside her mother's bed. The room was silent except for the soft beeping of the machines. Her mother, Sarah, looked pale and weak. She smiled gently and touched Emma's cheek. "Sweetheart, Mommy is okay," she whispered. Emma tried to smile back, but her eyes were filled with tears. She knew her mother wasn't okay. For weeks, Sarah had been working day and night at a large company owned by billionaire CEO Alexander Reed. She never complained, even when she became sick, because she had no choice. Since Emma's father had died years ago, Sarah was all alone, raising her daughter and struggling to pay the bills. That morning, Sarah had collapsed at work and was rushed to the hospital. The doctor entered the room with a serious expression and said, "She needs complete rest. Her body is exhausted. If she keeps pushing herself, it could become very dangerous." Sarah nodded quietly. Emma held her mother's hand tightly and said, "Mommy, promise me you'll stay here and get better." Sarah smiled weakly and replied, "I can't, sweetheart. If I don't go back to work, we won't have money for rent." Emma lowered her head. She was too young to understand everything, but she knew one thing. Her mother was tired, very tired. The next morning, Sarah left the hospital against the doctor's advice and returned to work. She was arranging files at her desk when dizziness hit her again. At that exact moment, CEO Alexander Reed walked through the office. He was known as a cold and strict businessman. Employees feared him because he rarely smiled and cared only about results. Suddenly, he noticed Sarah nearly falling. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine, sir," she replied quickly. Alexander frowned. "You don't look fine." Before Sarah could answer, a small voice interrupted. "Mommy." Everyone turned. Little Emma stood at the office entrance, wearing her school uniform and carrying a tiny backpack. She had come alone. She ran toward her mother and hugged her tightly. "Mommy, why are you here?" "The doctor said you need to rest." Sarah looked embarrassed. "I have to work, sweetheart." Emma looked around the huge office and her eyes finally landed on Alexander Reed. She slowly walked toward him. The employees became nervous because nobody dared approach the CEO so casually. The little girl looked up at him and asked, "Mister, are you the boss?" Alexander stared at her and replied, "Yes." She swallowed hard and then asked softly, "Can you please let Mommy rest just one day?" The entire office became silent. Emma's eyes filled with tears. She doesn't sleep. She doesn't eat properly. She coughs at night and thinks I don't hear her. Every morning she says she's okay, but she's always tired. I don't need toys. I don't need new clothes. I just want my mommy to stay with me. Can you please let her rest just one day? No one moved. No one spoke. Alexander stood frozen. The little girl's words pierced his heart. Suddenly, memories flooded his mind. Years ago, he had a mother just like Sarah. She worked endlessly to raise him. She became sick, but he was too busy chasing success to notice. One day, she died, and his biggest regret was never giving her enough time to rest. He looked at Emma and then at Sarah. For the first time in many years, his eyes became moist. He cleared his throat and asked gently, "How old are you?" 7, she answered. "And you came here alone?" Emma nodded. "I was scared Mommy would work again." Alexander couldn't speak for several seconds. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "Your mommy isn't working today, or tomorrow, or next week." Sarah looked shocked. "Sir, I can't afford." He raised his hand and said, "You are on paid medical leave." The entire office stared at him in disbelief. Tears rolled down Sarah's cheeks. "Sir, thank you." But Alexander wasn't finished. He turned toward the employees and asked, how many of you haven't taken a proper vacation this year? Almost every hand slowly went up. He looked around the room and for the first time noticed their exhausted faces, the late nights, the stress, and the sacrifices. He suddenly realized that he had built a successful company but forgotten the people who made it successful. He looked back at Emma. A 7-year-old girl had taught him what no business school ever could. He crouched down in front of her and said, "Thank you." Emma looked confused. "For what?" "For reminding me of something important." She smiled and asked, "Will Mommy really rest?" He nodded and replied, "I promise." Emma wrapped her tiny arms around him. The CEO of a billion-dollar company stood there in complete shock because nobody had hugged him in years. Slowly, he hugged her back. 1 week later, Alexander introduced new policies at the company including mandatory vacations, medical support, flexible schedules for parents, and mental health programs. Employees couldn't believe the transformation. News about the changes spread everywhere. Reporters asked him what inspired him, and he simply smiled and said, "A little girl asked me a question I couldn't answer." Months later, Sarah recovered completely. One afternoon, she and Emma were invited to the company's annual celebration. When they arrived, Alexander greeted them personally. Emma grinned and said, "Mommy rests now." Alexander laughed and replied, "Yes, she does." Then Emma looked at him carefully and asked, "And do you rest?" He paused because nobody had ever asked him that question. Finally, he smiled and said, "I'm learning." Emma nodded proudly and said, "Good. Everybody needs rest." Alexander looked at the little girl and felt something warm in his heart. Success wasn't only about money, buildings, or power. Sometimes true success meant hearing a child's simple request, "Can you please let Mommy rest just one day?" And sometimes those few innocent words were powerful enough to change a person's life forever.